At 54, 3 weeks after she signed the divorce papers on a kitchen table that still had his coffee ring on it. Lorraine Swick sat in the parking lot of a Dollar General in Opal Creek, Tennessee with $178 in her checking account, a cardboard box of her own belongings in the back seat, and a voicemail she had listened to 4 times without knowing what to do with it. The voicemail was from a man named Gerald Pugh, who said he was the property manager for a storage unit facility on Route 9, and that there was a unit registered in the name of her ex-husband, Clint Swick, which had been paid up through the end of the year, and that Clint had listed her as the secondary contact, and that seeing as Clint had passed in January, she might want to come by at her convenience. She had not known Clint owned a storage unit. She had not known Clint had listed her as anything. They had been divorced for 11 days when he died of a heart attack in the parking lot of the Moose Lodge, where he had spent most Friday evenings for the last 6 years of their marriage. She had spent most of those Friday evenings at home, wondering what exactly she had done wrong, and then, sometime around year 4, wondering if it even mattered. She had been married to Clint Swick for 26 years. She had left him for a reason she could not explain to her sister or her daughter without sounding small, which was that he had stopped talking to her. Not all at once. Not in a way she could point to. Just slowly, the way water recedes from a shore you don't notice going dry until one day you realize you haven't felt the tide in years. He wasn't cruel. He was present in the way a piece of furniture is present. He ate what she cooked and said it was good and fell asleep in the recliner before 9, and on Fridays he put on the good flannel and drove to the lodge, and that was the shape of their life for the better part of a decade. She had tried. She wanted you to know that before anything else. She had tried the way a person tries when they're not sure they're even trying in the right direction. If you've ever sat across a dinner table from someone you once loved and realized you have nothing left to say to them that you haven't said, and that saying it again wouldn't change anything, then you already know the particular exhaustion Lorraine Swick carried into her 50s. If that sounds familiar, stay with us, because what she found at the end of Route 9 is the part that changes everything you think you know about quiet people and the lives they carry in silence. Before we go any further, if stories like this one matter to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories reach now. Lorraine. She had grown up in Opal Creek, which was the kind of town where everybody's business was more or less public property, and where divorce, even now, even in the modern age, still drew a certain look from certain women at the Methodist Church. She'd met Clint at 27 at the county fair, where he was running the ring toss booth for the volunteer fire department, patient and steady with every kid who stepped up, never once making one feel bad for missing. She'd watched him for half an hour before she walked over, and when she finally did, he handed her a ring and said, "Your turn," and she'd made it on the first try, and he'd said, "Well, that's something," in a voice so dry and quiet that she'd laughed out loud. They were married 14 months later. For the first 8 years or so, the quiet in him had felt like peace. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things. The way she held her coffee mug with both hands when she was worried, the way she always checked the mail twice on days she was expecting something. He'd leave her tea on the nightstand before she woke up. Small things. The kind of things that say "I see you" without saying a word. But peace and silence are not the same thing, and it took her the better part of a decade to feel the difference. The cooling happened in his mid-40s. No fight, no event she could trace it to. Just a gradual dimming, the way a bulb does before it goes. Still on, still technically functional, but something missing from the quality of the light. He started going to the lodge more. He stopped asking about her day. When she told him things, her eyes on his face, he'd say, in the particular tone that means "I heard the sound of your words, but not the words themselves." She stopped telling him things. She stopped reaching. He, in his way, let her stop. By the time she was 50, she had filed the divorce papers twice and let them expire twice. The third time she signed them. She had been so certain she knew what she was leaving. A man who had checked out. A man who had nothing left to say. She thought that was the whole story. She drove to Route 9 on a Thursday morning in February with the heater rattling, and the pavement still gray with last night's frost. Gerald Pugh was a small, careful man in his 60s with a ring of keys on his belt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he met her at the front gate with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Swick," he said, and then seemed to remember that might not be right anymore and stopped. "It's fine," she said. "I'm sorry about Clint," he said. He paused. He was a good man to have around this place. She looked at him. "You knew him?" Gerald looked at the ground a moment, like he was choosing his words. "He was here most Fridays," he said carefully. "And some Saturdays. I figured you knew." She had thought he was at the lodge. She had assumed the lodge for 6 years. She said, "I'd like to see the unit." It was toward the back of the facility, Unit 114, a standard 10 by 20, with a roll-up door that Gerald unlocked and pushed up for her. She stood at the threshold and did not go in for a long moment. It was not what she'd expected. She hadn't known what she'd expected, but it wasn't this. There were tables. Folding tables, the kind churches use for potlucks, 3 of them pushed together along the center. On the tables were machines, sewing machines, 4 of them. 2 electric and 2 older hand-crank models, all in different states of assembly. There were shelves along 2 walls holding bolts of fabric, organized by color. Dark blues and greens and the particular bright orange of hunting vests. There were boxes of thread sorted. There were tools she didn't know the names of. There was a pegboard hung with scissors, seam rippers, tape measures, each one outlined in marker so you'd know where it went back. And on one of the tables, folded flat, was a stack of finished vests. Bright orange hunting vests, the kind hunters wore in the woods in November. She walked to the nearest shelf and opened a banker's box she found beneath it. Inside were receipts, hundreds of them going back years, organized by date in rubber-banded bundles. Fabric, thread, Velcro zippers, boxes of those in orange. She found Gerald still by the door. "What was he doing here?" she asked. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He reached up and took off his glasses and folded them and put them in his chest pocket. "You might want to sit down," he said. "There's a stool behind the 3rd table. I'll get us some coffee from the office." He did, and she sat, and he stood near the roll-up door with his cup in both hands and told her. Clint Swick, Gerald said, had rented Unit 114 7 years ago. For the first year he mostly stored regular things, holiday decorations, the overflow from the garage. But then about 6 years back, he'd started coming in differently. With the sewing machines, one at a time, with the fabric, with the tools. He taught himself to sew, Gerald said, in the same tone you'd use for a thing you still don't quite believe even after you've watched it happen. You have to understand, this was a man who, when he started, couldn't thread the machine without asking me to read the manual. I'm not good at sewing either. We figured it out together from a YouTube video on my phone one Friday night. Took us 2 hours. Lorraine stared at her coffee. He started with simple stuff, Gerald went on. Patching, hemming, but he had a thing in his head about the vests. He nodded at the stack on the table. He'd read somewhere that hunting accidents go up when guys wear old gear, faded gear, where the orange isn't bright anymore. He'd lost someone. Gerald paused. I don't know who, he never said the name. But he'd lost someone years back to a hunting accident. It stayed with him, and he decided the thing he could do about it was make sure the men around here had proper vests. She didn't know. In 26 years of marriage, she had never heard Clint mention losing anyone to a hunting accident. He gave them away, Gerald said. Free. He'd leave them at the feed co-op, at the sporting goods place on Main, at the VFW. He'd ask around quietly, do you know anybody who needs a vest? And he'd get it to them with no name on it. He didn't want anybody knowing. He said. Gerald stopped, turned his coffee cup in his hands. He said once, when I asked him why he didn't just donate to a program or something, he said, Gerald, if a man knows somebody feels sorry for him, he won't take the thing he needs. He wanted them to feel like they'd found it, not like they'd been given it. Lorraine put both hands flat on the folding table. The laminate surface was cool and slightly gritty with fabric dust. How many? She said. Gerald thought about it. 6 years. He got fast by the end. Maybe 200? Maybe more. A lot went to families that couldn't outfit their kids for deer season, young fathers. A couple of older guys on fixed incomes. He looked at the bright orange stack. He kept a book. He went to the shelf and came back with a composition notebook worn at the corners, the cover soft with handling. He held it out to her. She opened it. Clint's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. Small, angular, letters pressed hard.
Like he was trying to make sure they stayed.
The first page said started November 2017. Below it a list, not names. Clint had been careful not to write names. 1 vest XL left at Co-op Tuesday. 1 vest M youth sizing VFW bulletin board. But there were notes beside each one, brief, in his hand. Kid at the gas station said his boy missed last season because the gear got too small. Dropped 1, in the size of the VFW Tuesday. Don't know if it was him. Man at the hardware store, hands shook when he counted change. Figure he's not flush. Left a 2XL at the sporting goods. 3 went to the fire department to keep in the truck, in case somebody comes in unprepared. Chief said they've needed that before. She turned pages. There were 234 entries, and in the back of the notebook, behind the last entry, were practice sheets. Pages where he'd written the same sentence over and over in different versions, crossing out and starting again. Lorraine, I know you think I've had nothing to say. Crossed out. Then, Lorraine, the truth is I've been ashamed of something for a long time and I didn't know how to. Crossed out. Then, on a page by itself, more recently, the handwriting steadier, Lorraine. I lost my brother Eddie to a hunting accident in 1999. I never told you because I didn't know how to talk about it without. And then it felt like too long had passed to bring it up. I know that doesn't make sense. I know the lodge was just where I went when I couldn't. I don't know how to explain it. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you about this place. Every Friday I drove out here, I thought I'd come home and finally say something. I'll keep trying. It stopped there. Lorraine sat in the folding chair in a storage unit on Route 9 with the composition notebook in her lap and the February cold coming in under the roll-up door. And she cried in the way she had not allowed herself to cry through the divorce, through the signing, through the 11 days between the papers and the phone call from the hospital. The kind of crying that comes from a place you sealed off a long time ago and forgot you'd sealed. She had spent 6 years deciding that Clint Swick was a man who had gone away from her and didn't care. She had been so certain of that verdict that she'd signed her name to it. And this whole time he had been 7 miles away in a storage unit on Route 9, teaching himself to sew hunting vests for men he'd never meet, because he had lost his brother Eddie in 1999 and never found a way to say so. She would carry that for the rest of her life. But she was going to carry it the way you carry a scar, not a wound. That distinction matters. We'll come back to it. She asked Gerald to let her come back the next day with her daughter, and Gerald said of course, and she drove home in the February dark with the heat rattling and her hands steadier than she expected on the wheel. Her daughter, Petra, was 24 and had her father's angular handwriting and her mother's habit of going quiet when she was upset. She had not been close to her father, had not known how to be close to a man who offered so little surface to hold on to, and she came to Route 9 the next morning, with her arms crossed against the cold and her face arranged in the particular expression of someone trying not to feel something. She uncrossed her arms around the 3rd page of the notebook. By the time she reached the practice letters in the back, she was sitting on the concrete floor of the unit with her back against the shelving and making no attempt to stop what was happening on her face. He never told me about Uncle Eddie, she said finally. He never told me either, Lorraine said. They sat with that a while. 234 vests, Petra said. She looked at the orange stack on the table. Do you know if anyone? Does anyone know where they came from? Gerald, who was leaning in the doorway giving them space, said, Nobody. That was the whole point. Petra reached out and touched the top vest on the stack. It was finished clean, flat seams, good Velcro, the orange bright and even. The kind of work a person does when they care about what they're making. He learned to sew, she said. Dad learned to sew. He did, Gerald said. He wasn't bad at it by the end. I've got 3 daughters. And he hemmed a pair of jeans for my youngest once when she left them here by accident. Never charged a thing. Just left them folded on the table. Now here is where the story turns, and we want you to stay with us because Lorraine could have let it end there. She could have taken the notebook home and put it in a drawer and let the whole thing fold into private grief. She almost did. There is nothing wrong with that choice. But then she got a phone call. It came 8 days after she first visited the storage unit, from a man named Bob Treadway, who introduced himself as the president of the Opal Creek Hunting and Conservation Club, and who said he'd heard, he didn't say how, that she was Clint Swick's widow, and that he had something he thought she ought to know. He was a broad, slow-talking man in his late 60s who met her at a diner on the highway, and who folded his hands on the table and said, without preamble, I knew about the unit. She waited. Not for long, he said. Clint let it slip about a year and a half ago. He came by a club meeting to drop off 4 vests for some younger members and I caught him in the parking lot. He made me promise not to tell. I've been carrying that promise for 18 months. He looked at his hands. He's gone now. I figure I can put it down. He told her about the phone calls he'd gotten over the years, members who'd found vests on the VFW bulletin board at the co-op, in the cab of their trucks after a Saturday event. Men who'd wondered where they came from. Men who'd gone back to ask if there were more. There was one boy in particular, Bob said. 22 years old, new to the area, didn't have money for gear, too proud to ask. He found a vest in his size on the bulletin board in October and figured it was somebody's lost and found. He took it and went out that season and got his first deer. Came back in February to return the vest because he still thought it was lost property. Bob smiled slowly. He was going to leave it on the same board with a note that said, "Found this. Think I owe someone a good season." Lorraine pressed her fingers to her mouth. When he found out where it had actually come from, Bob said he wanted to do something. He didn't know Clint had passed yet. He came to me because he'd heard I ran the club, and when I told him, Bob cleared his throat. He asked if the widow would accept a thank you. He's 22. He wrote it by hand. Bob set an envelope on the table. She picked it up. Inside, in a young man's careful handwriting, was a note that said, "Mr. Swick, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I got my first deer this year and I couldn't have without the orange vest I found at VFW. If you're the one who left it, I want you to know it mattered to me more than you probably know. I'm going to keep doing this. Hunting, I mean. It's the first thing in a while that made me feel like myself. Thank you for what you left behind. Cody Marsh." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her coat pocket. "How many people know about the unit?" she asked. Bob thought about it. "More than Clint thought," he said. "Less than you'd think. The men who figured it out kept it quiet, because they understood that was the point. But they know." She drove back to the storage unit and let herself in with the key Gerald had given her. She stood in the middle of it for a long time with the February light coming through the open door. She was 54 years old. She was living in her sister's spare room. She had $178 in her account and a box of her own belongings in a borrowed car and a 26-year marriage that had turned out to contain a person she had never fully met. She had a choice to make. She could close the unit, pay out the lease, take the machines, donate what was usable, let the whole thing go quietly the way Clint would have let it go quietly. That would be the sensible thing. She stood there and thought about a man who lost his brother in the woods in 1999 and spent the next 24 years carrying it alone because he didn't know how to put it down any other way than to turn it into 234 vests for men he'd never meet. A man who drove every Friday to a storage unit and sat at a folding table and taught himself to sew so that other men could go into the woods and come home, and who had spent the last year and a half practicing, in the back of a composition notebook, how to tell his wife what he was doing. She called. Petra. Petra came. They looked at the machines, the fabric, the pegboard with every tool outlined in marker. Petra, who worked at the elementary school in the front office and had her father's steadiness and her mother's stubbornness, picked up a finished vest and turned it over in her hands. "We're not closing this," she said. It was not a question. "I need to learn how to use a sewing machine," Lorraine said. "So do I," Petra said. "Here is what you have to understand about the next part, and this is the part we want you to sit with, because this is the part that matters most." Lorraine Swick had never in her life considered herself a maker of things. She was a woman who had worked 20 years at the county clerk's office, who kept a clean house and a decent garden, who had survived a quiet marriage and a quieter divorce, and was trying in her 54th year to figure out what came next. She had no particular skill and no particular plan, and a sewing machine she didn't know how to thread. She sat at the folding table in Unit 114 on a Saturday in March, with Gerald's phone, showing her a YouTube video about bobbin tension and a spool of orange thread in her hands, and she cried a little and then she tried it. It took her 4 Saturdays to make her first vest. It was uneven at the seams and one of the Velcro pieces pulled after the first week, and she had to take it apart and redo it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and slightly stupid and very aware of how many years Clint had gotten good at this without her knowing. But she made it. And she made the next one cleaner, and the next one cleaner than that. Petra came on weekends, then twice a week. Then she brought a friend from the school, a young woman named Sasha who had grown up sewing with her grandmother in eastern Kentucky, and who looked at the setup in Unit 114 and said quietly, "I can help you." By May there were 4 of them at the tables on Saturday mornings. By July 6, they started leaving the vests the same way Clint had. At the co-op, the sporting goods store, the VFW. No names, no note, no explanation. Just a bright orange vest in someone's size, left where a person who needed it might find it. The men came the way Clint had apparently always predicted they would. Quietly, one at a time, showing up at the unit through word of mouth, shits in their hands. a retired mechanic named Lester who'd heard from Bob Treadway that a widow was keeping Clint's thing going and wanted her to know that a vest he'd found at the co-op 3 years ago had been the one his grandson wore on his first season out. A young father who worked the overnight shift at the plant and couldn't afford to kit out his 2 boys for deer season, and had found 2 vests on the VFW board in October and had never known where to send his thanks. Cody Marsh came himself, finally, one Saturday in June. He was 22 with a serious face and his good truck freshly washed, and he stood on the threshold of Unit 114 and looked at the women at the tables and the orange fabric and the spools of thread and said, "I want to help." He could not sew. He could, however, build shelving, repair machines, and run the kind of errands that keep a small operation from stalling. He started coming Saturdays. Then he brought another man from his hunting club. Then that man brought his father. It grew the way Clint had never let it grow, because Clint had needed it to stay invisible. Lorraine didn't need that. What she built was the same thing Clint had built, only in the light. She should have stopped there. The unit was full, the vests were going out. The small, quiet thing Clint had started was continuing. That was enough. And then she found out about the county zoning board. The storage facility on Route 9 was at the edge of a parcel that a commercial developer out of Nashville had been quietly assembling for a year and a half. The plan was a distribution center. Good for the county. Solid tax base. The kind of project that looks like common sense from the front and only looks different when you're standing inside the thing that's in the way. The facility manager got the letter in April. Gerald told Lorraine in June because he thought she should know. The demolition timeline put Unit 114 gone by the end of the year. Her first thought, she told Petra later, was not about the machines or the fabric or the vests. It was about the composition notebook, about Clint's handwriting in the back pages, about the fact that this place had been the one place in his life where he wasn't pretending to be anything other than what he was. A man who had lost his brother and was trying, in the only way he'd found, to make sure it meant something. The developer held a public information meeting at the county courthouse. Lorraine went. She brought Petra, and Gerald, and Bob Treadway, and Cody Marsh, and 3 of the men who'd been coming to the unit on Saturdays. The developer's representative was professional and prepared, with a site plan and job creation numbers and the smooth delivery of a person who has done this before and expects it to go a particular way. The county commissioner asked if anyone wished to speak in response. Bob Treadway stood up. He was not the sort of man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. He just said, "My name is Bob Treadway. I've lived in this county for 63 years. The man who built what's in Unit 114 died in January. He spent 6 years in that storage unit teaching himself to sew because he lost his brother in a hunting accident and didn't know another way to carry it. He made 234 vests. He gave every one of them away free to people he never met. He didn't tell anyone. His wife didn't even know." He paused. "I just thought the board ought to know what they're voting to bulldoze." Sat down. Lester, the retired mechanic, stood up next. He talked for less than a minute. He said he'd found a vest on the co-op bulletin board 3 years ago and put it away in the closet and hadn't thought much about it until his grandson wore it on his first hunt and came home at dusk with his first deer and a look on his face that. Lester said he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. He said the vest was still hanging in his grandson's room. He said he hadn't known until 6 months ago where it had come from. He sat down. Cody Marsh went next. He read his own note out loud, the one he'd written by hand to a man he'd never met, about a vest he'd found on a bulletin board in October, and a first deer and the first thing in a while that made him feel like himself. He read it in the voice of a 22-year-old who is not accustomed to reading things out loud in public, and who does it anyway, which is a particular kind of courage that a room tends to recognize. Then Lorraine stood up. She set 2 things on the podium: the composition notebook and the envelope with Cody's letter. "My husband owned that unit," she said. "We were divorced 11 days before he died. I didn't know about the vests, the machines, or any of the rest of it until after he was gone." She stopped. "I found out the way you find out something you should have known a long time ago, which is in a cold storage unit in February with a notebook in your lap and nobody to explain it to you." She looked at the board. "He left the unit in his name with me as secondary contact. He is gone and I am the secondary contact. I am asking this board to deny the demolition order for Unit 114 and to allow us to relocate the operation to a permanent site before the rest of the facility comes down." She picked up the notebook. There are 234 entries in here. Men in this county who went into the woods safer because of what was built in that unit. I intend to keep building it, and I intend to keep giving it away for free, and I need somewhere to do that. She looked at the developer's representative and at the developer's site plan, and she said, "Build your distribution center. This county needs the work. But there is one unit in that facility that is not a storage unit. It is the only thing my husband built that he was completely himself inside of. You can route around it, or you can move us first. Either way, we're not done." She picked up the notebook and she held it to her chest and she sat down. The board voted to grant a 60-day delay for Unit 114, pending a proposed relocation to a county-owned building behind the VFW that had been sitting unused for 3 years. The developer did not object. This surprised Lorraine. His representative caught her in the hallway after, and said quietly, "My grandfather couldn't afford hunting gear when he was young. Someone anonymous left him a vest at a church sale in 1971. He talked about it until he died." He shook Lorraine's hand. "We'll work around the timeline." She drove home that night with Petra in the passenger seat, and the February cold replaced now by summer heat through the open windows, and she didn't say much. And Petra didn't either, and the silence between them was a different kind than the one Lorraine had lived inside her marriage. It was the kind that comes after something has been said that needed saying, not the kind that comes from nothing left to say. The unit is in the VFW building now. It has 2 more sewing machines than it started with and a proper cutting table that Cody Marsh built from lumber, and plans he found on the internet. On the wall above the pegboard, every tool still outlined in marker, the way Clint had it. There is a photograph that Gerald found on his phone and had printed at the drugstore. It is not a good photograph. It is Clint at the folding table in Unit 114 on some Friday evening, bent over a vest, reading glasses on, face down in the work. Gerald had taken it on a whim one night and forgotten about it until he went looking. Lorraine had it framed. The vests still go out the same way Clint left them. Quietly, no name, no note, just orange in the right size left where a person who needs it might find it. That part hasn't changed. Some things you keep the way they were, because the person who built them knew something about shame and pride, and the exact weight of receiving a thing from someone you'll never have to thank. She is still learning to sew. She is not as good as Clint was by the end, and she may never be, and she has stopped measuring herself by that. She found the divorce folder when she finally went through the last lab box from the car, the one she'd carried out of the house in February with her hands shaking and her jaw set. It was in there with the utility bills and the Christmas cards she'd meant to sort, and a pen that had dried out. She sat on the bed in her sister's spare room, which was now just her room, and she held the papers for a long time. She didn't burn them. She isn't the burning type. She put them back in the folder and put the folder in the nightstand drawer, and she doesn't look at them often, but when she does not feel what she expected to feel. She does not feel guilt. She does not feel triumph. She feels the way you feel when you finally understand the shape of something you spent years holding in the dark, not changed, exactly, but finally oriented. She had been so certain she knew who Clint Swick was. She had signed her name to that certainty. She had been wrong in the particular way you can only be wrong about a quiet person, which is to confuse their silence for absence and their privacy for emptiness, and to stop knocking on the door long before the room behind it has gone dark. The room had not gone dark. It had been bright orange and very busy, and she simply hadn't known where to look. There is a line in Clint's notebook, in the practice pages at the back, that she reads sometimes when the Saturday morning volunteers have all gone home and she's alone in the VFW room, with the machines covered, and the fabric sorted, and the new vests folded on the shelf. It is not a finished sentence, it is just a start. Lorraine, I want to tell you something about Eddie. He never got to finish it, but she knows what it cost him to begin. She is 54 years old, and she did not know how to sew 6 months ago, and she is not a natural, and she has had to start at the start more than once already, and she will again. She is not too proud to do that. That is what she learned from a composition notebook and a storage unit and a stack of finished vests in bright orange on a February morning in Opal Creek, Tennessee. The quiet ones are not always empty. Sometimes they are full of something they haven't found the words for yet. And the only way to know the difference is to stay long enough to find out. Walt Clint never got to finish his letter, but the vests are still going out. Every season, bright and orange and anonymous, left in the places where a man who needs one will find one without anyone watching him take it. That is the truest thing he left behind. And Lorraine Swick is the reason it's still out there. Keep looking. Keep knocking. You might be surprised what's on the other side of a door you decided was empty. That's the story of Lorraine Swick. And we're grateful you stayed with us all the way through. If this one meant something to you, leave us a comment below. Tell us what you're taking away from it. Or tell us about a quiet person in your life you may have underestimated. We read everyone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. There are more stories like this one, and we don't want you to miss them.